Okay,
नहीं, अच्छा, thank you.
fine. Yeah. So this is where we have got the log, the debug log. Fine. So the actual code got executed. This execution log is giving you a complete detail of what all things happened. Okay. Variable assignment happened. There's again variable assignment happened for 17 more records. Okay. Now, a lot of these things, we will not understand basically, because that's something which is defined in a method which we will not understand, right? So what exactly we try to do is, uh, when you are trying to debug a code, what we try to do is we try to define system.debug methods. Okay, so system.debug basically method is used for uh, printing a specific value in the debug log. Okay, in the debug log. Why do we need that? We need that to define the checkpoints. Usually what happens, let's say you have an Apex code. Okay, think about it. You are at point 1. Okay, you have an Apex code, and Apex code should take you at point 5. Let's say, think about it. Okay, you started here, the apex got executed, but you realize that you have not reached point 5. It can be anything. Let's say you have to update some data or something like that. Your apex is executing, but you're not getting the end result. You're not reaching from here, you're not reaching here, right? This is where we will need to debug, right? Now if I need to debug this entire thing, there might be a lot of things which are happening. From here to here there are a lot of things which are happening. Let's say there is a query which is actually retrieving the data, and after that there is some update happening on the query or something like that. All right, now you realize that you have not reached step 5 even after executing the code. So what you have to do, you just have to go and check the debug log, right? But just to make your job easy, because debug log is tracking a lot of information, and to go and read each of them becomes sometimes a little challenging for you. All that you try to do is you try to set some checkpoints. That, okay, fine, let me put a checkpoint here, let me put a checkpoint here, that am I reaching here correctly or not, am I reaching here correctly or not. Based on that you can understand. Okay, if you are not reaching here properly, which means the error itself is here itself. If I have not got the expected result here, then it means the error is here. If I am not, if I'm okay here, if I reached till this stage properly but I did not reach here properly, then the error is here. Okay, so we try to break down the entire transaction or the entire set of code into small chunks, so that we can figure out where the error might have happened. If I have reached here also properly, and if I'm not reached here properly, which means the error is lying somewhere here. All right, now let's say, okay, let's say you have a method, and this method will actually run a SQL query. Okay, it will execute a select statement, and then it will update the records, and then it will send emails to all updated records. Let's say this is what you have written in the query, in the code. First, it's gonna query the data. Secondly, it's gonna update the records. Thirdly, it's gonna send email to all updated records. All right. And even before the query, let's say you have one more thing. There is a string and you have a set method for getting the value of the string. Okay, you have written a set method. Someone is inserting the value of the string. That string is being used in the query, and after that all the records which are being retrieved are updated, and then an email is sent to all the records, or an email is being sent to someone. Okay, there are, so this can be your entire code. So this code gets a string value, it executes a query, it updates the records, then it sends an email. All right, now these are what different stages. Okay, so rather than you inspecting the entire debug log, what you can do is you can actually go ahead and after the string gets its value, you can put, let's say, when you executed this code, this is not working okay for you. So what you can do is you can just put a system.debug here, system.debug here, and check the value of that particular string. Let's say the name of the string is s1. Okay, what will this system.debug do? It will show the value of that particular string on this line. Okay, so you understand what is the actual value which is being assigned to it. Is it being assigned properly, or there is some problem with my set method here? Got it? So if you're not getting the end result, firstly what will you check? You will first of all check that, okay fine, if my string is getting proper value or not, right? The same way you might want to do a system.debug here to check your query, to see some query data. All right, now this system.debug will check whether there was, the query is fetching results or not. And then you can do again a system.debug somewhere here to figure out whether the records were updated or not. Okay, so whatever variable. Now the system.debug is going to do what? It's actually going to go and save, put this line in the debug log. So looking at this, if your expected string value was, let's say, ABCD, and if you see that, okay, here it displays ABCD, which means this step is okay. Here system.debug query data, if the data query has got retrieved some data, if that shows that, okay, there's some result which has been retrieved, you are okay on this. If the system.debug shows, there is some value which has been assigned to the updated record, you are okay on this as well. Correct? So that's how a system.debug will help you put, certain checkpoints in place, which you can easily go ahead and track that, okay fine, if my code is fine till here or not, and that way you can easily figure out your errors. All right. Now if you, developer console is one thing that we have seen. The other place where you can track your debug logs, this is mainly used for the code which is already saved somewhere. All right, let's say a trigger or kind of thing. With developer console, I had the advantage of tracking this thing, tracking the code of anonymous code also. Okay, and you can definitely execute a class method or something like that, and you will have logs for that as well. But the debug log which you have in the user interface is mainly meant for the code which is already saved, maybe a trigger or a method. Okay, if you want to track that, by default debug log is turned off. If you want to track debug logs, you have to just go to setup logs, click on debug logs, and you have to set the debug log. You will have to set the user trace flag, that for which user you want to track the debug logs. So if you say, if there is a method, okay, and you are writing the method and you are the one who is actually working on that method, so you will execute it for testing purpose, and then the system should only track debug logs for you. It should not track for everyone. So for that reason, we just need to go to the debug logs and we have to define for which user we want to track the debug logs, from when to when. Okay, from which date till which date. So usually these debug log tracking is something which is not which you don't do for very long. Let's say uh, you're trying to debug a code now, so you will start it today and you will try to end it by tomorrow, because you don't want system to track unnecessary logs, right? And once this thing has been defined for a user, that this user debug logs are gonna be tracked, what will happen, you will have once you call that trigger or something, that particular trigger, all the logs files of that trigger will be stored here. Trigger or apex code. So now whatever apex code runs or executes, there is a log which will be created for that and it will get stored here, right? So we have seen both the ways. We have seen it here and we have also seen it here. Okay, you can try and check the logs here. So whatever you try to execute, see, your developer console has, you can definitely go ahead and execute anonymous code from here, that will also be tracked. Otherwise also, if you are executing something else, some other code or class method or anything, you will have a log file for that also. See, so these are the logs which you find here. Okay, so that's about the debug logs, and how do we actually put the checkpointers in the debug log, just to check how things are working. Now, handling exceptions in Apex. Sometimes there will be exceptions. Exceptions means sometimes your code might not be executing because of an exception. Okay. Let's say, uh, okay. So if I go by the example which we were talking about, you are trying to update the record. I said that it will get a string value, query the data, and then update will happen, and then the email will be sent. Okay. When the record tries to update the record, it sees that there is a validation rule which is not allowing it to update the record. Fine, possible. The validation rule did not allow the record update to happen. And that's the reason why the next step also could not happen. Right? So, what you have to do to make things even more simpler and easier for you, while you're doing, you will have to handle the exceptions also. Okay, so whatever is the exception, whatever is basically the error, so handling exception is basically catching the errors and trying to deal with them. All right, so we call them exceptions. So something which is not workable on that particular moment. Let's say there's a validation which is stopping. See, when some code has got saved, which means somehow from your syntax point of view, the code is okay, but it is not executing at a certain given situation. Maybe because the record that you're trying to update is locked. Maybe the record which you are trying to update has a validation rule. Maybe the record that you're trying to update is already deleted. It does not exist. There can be a lot of reasons for that, right? So that particular thing is the exception there. The record does not exist, or the record is locked, or the record is not, it has a validation rule. That is the exception. Okay, so we call it handling exception in Apex. How would you handle the exception in Apex? Apex uses exceptions to note errors and other events. Okay, so any particular error will be taken as an exception. So again, this is talking about something which is an exception. Usually your code would work fine for that, but for a particular record or for a particular set of records it did not execute. That's exception. Okay, so that's the reason why we are not calling it error, we are calling it exception. Error can be something which is a generic error, so it will happen for any record. Okay, let's say you're trying to insert an account without account ID. That's a generic error because it's a mandatory field. So that's not an error. Sorry, that's not an exception. That's an error, a generic error. When I'm talking about that, okay, when there's an account which needs to be updated, maybe the type of the account needs to be updated. It works absolutely okay for most of the records, let's say, and for a certain set of record, it might not be happening. Okay, because maybe you have activated some validation rule for it or something like that. That's where the exception is. Okay. So Apex uses exceptions to note errors and other events that disrupt the normal flow of code execution. Okay. The actual execution gets disrupted because of these exceptions, and that's what we handle using our handling exception technique. So for dealing with the exceptions, we have a very simple method or a process that's called try catch finally statements. Okay, what is this try catch finally statement? Try catch finally statement is basically a set of statements which we can use for dealing with the exceptions. We try to do, we try to execute the code, and at the time of execution we catch the exception, and then we instruct that, okay, finally do this. So let's look into this. The try statement, so try catch finally usually have three statements. Try, which is actually going to do the, which is the actual code execution. The Apex tries to execute the code and it catches the exception, and based on the exception you try to do, you finally do something else. That's what try catch finally does. Okay. So the try statement identifies a block of code in which an exception can occur. So try statement will have the code which can have exception. Okay. The catch statement identifies a block of code that can handle a particular type of exception. Okay. So the catch statement will actually handle the exception. A single try statement can have zero or more associated catch statements. So one single try statement can be associated to multiple catch statements. So if you try to do one thing, you can catch multiple exceptions under one try. Okay. Each catch statement must have a unique exception type. Okay. There is a exception type that you have to assign for the catch statement. Once a particular exception type is caught in one catch block, the remaining catch blocks, if any, aren't executed. So the moment it finds one exception, if you have written 5 catch statements, and out of those, if you catch one exception, it catches one exception, it will stop the execution there itself. It will not go and catch other things because the code already has an exception and it cannot move further. So there is no point actually going and catching other exceptions. Right? The finally statement identifies a block of code that is guaranteed to execute and allow you to clean up your code. A single try statement can have up to one associated finally statement. So one try statement will only have one finally statement. So finally statement is basically to do something that you want to perform or execute just to come out of it, or to clean up the data. Let's say you have created an account and then you're trying to create a contact, and there's an exception that you catch in creating the contact. Then you might want to roll back the account also, the one that you created. You might want to delete that account also. So that's the reason why we are saying that okay, it sometimes is used for to clean up your data, clean up your code, right? We just want to make sure that the one account which was created, that also does not remain there. Okay, so just to take make sure that you are taking your data to the same position where you started, right? Okay, what is the syntax of try catch finally statement? It's very simple. Try, write the code block whatever you're trying to do, catch, the catch statement. So whatever code you're trying to execute, that should be written here. Catch statement should be written here. Catch statement should be written here. So which type of exception you want to catch, and a variable name that you have to give to the exception. And then the code block that you want to write to handle the exception. Second catch statement in case you want optional additional catch statement. Okay. Again the code block to handle the second exception. And finally statement and the code that you want to write finally whatever you want to do. Alright. So this is how it's gonna work. Now we saw one thing in the previous slide, that when we are writing a catch statement, try the code block is pretty simple, but when I'm writing the catch statement I have to write the exception type, right? So what is this exception type and which all exception types are available with Apex? That's what we have to understand.
Hello, Ji.
What all exception types are allowed, that's what we have to understand. So the first exception type, the most common one that you come across is a DML exception. DML exception, as I said, an insert, update, delete that you're trying to do and it's not happening. So it can be due to several reasons, right? A DML operation you're trying to perform and it's not happening. So that's a DML exception. Any problem with a DML statement such as insert statement, missing a required field on a record, right? You're trying to perform a DML, but the DML is not happening. So the reason can be anything. Some validation might be clashing, some required field might be missing. So those exceptions will be caught as DML exceptions. That's one type of exception. List exception. Any problem with a list such as attempting to access an index that is out of bounds. So list exception is when you are trying to fetch value from a list of records, but the list does not have that many number of values. Okay. So let's say there is a list, it has only 3 values. You're trying to attempt, fetch the fourth value of the list. The fourth value is not there. The list only has 3 values. That sort of exceptions will be handled from the list exception. Then null pointer exception. What's a null pointer exception? Any problem with dereferencing a null variable. Okay, you're trying to reference a variable, but that variable does not have any value. It's null. It's not even zero. It's null. So that's a null pointer exception. You're trying to query some data using a null value, or you are trying to uh, maybe use a variable somewhere, and that variable is completely null. It does not have any value. That's the null pointer exception. So this null pointer exception type will catch all the null pointer exception errors, right? So why this exception type? Because if you define the exception type while catching the exception, you will understand what is the problem, right? You will understand that what exactly is the problem which has happened with my code. So if you find a DML exception, you will know that, okay, fine, and now at least I know that the reason I could not achieve whatever I was trying to achieve, because there is a DML exception, which means the DML is not working properly, right? And then you start looking into, what might be the reason for the DML exception. Are you not supplying the required field, or do you have a validation rule? What is actually causing problem for it? Correct. And that message will also be given. So you actually drill down to that level, you exactly get that message also, that why the DML thing failed. Correct. Then there is null pointer exception. Then there is query exception. Any problem with SQL query, such as assigning a query that returns no records. That's also what we were talking in the debug logs. The scenario that we were discussing. That if I'm running a query and whether I'm getting a record from there or not. So any problem with SQL queries, such as assigning a query that returns no records or more than one record to a single ton subject variable. So query exception will basically catch two types of exceptions. One, if there is a query being executed and it is not fetching any record, that can be an exception. Whatever query you have written, that does not have any data. So that can be one type of exception. The other type of exception can be the situation where you are running a query to fetch data for one record, but it's returning more than one record. So if it is returning more than one record, then there will be again a problem. If you have one single S object variable, you do not have a list, and query is returning multiple records, then there will be a query exception and S object exception. Okay, this is S object exception. Any problem with S object record, such as attempting to change a field in an update statement that can only be changed during insert. So S object exception is something which deals with any particular um, S object fields and their changes, right? So anything that occurs in the S object. So if you have defined an S object variable, you are trying to go and update the value of that variable. Okay, let's say there is account and you are trying to update account dot type, assign some value to it, and you are not able to assign the value. That will be handled as an S object exception. Fine. So now, which all exceptions we are talking about here? One second. So what all exceptions we are talking about here? We are talking about DML exceptions. So these are the generic exception types. Your exceptions will be because of DML, or there will be list exception, null pointer exception, query exception, S object exception. Okay. So let's say you try something like this: account A equals new account. There's some value you try to insert A. Okay. Now this is a DML attempt. Okay. You want to check if there is some error which has happened here or not. So chances in this case are what? The exception which will happen in case there is any exception, or if we are not getting the result. The exception will be because of the DML exception, correct? Obviously here the exception will be because of DML, because what I am doing here is I am actually doing a DML, right? So when you write the catch statement for it, you will say DML exception E or whatever variable name you want to give, T, whatever you give it. Okay, so this is what you're trying to execute. This is the exception which has got caught. Okay, DML exception, call it D or something, and in this catch block you can handle with that exception. So what would I want to do? I would want to definitely see what exactly that exception message is. And where will I want to see it? In the debug log. So you can write system.debug d.get message. Okay, so this will display you the message of this exception. So that while you're referring to the debug log, you get to see exactly the exception that happened and the message that it shows. Got it? So that's how simple it is. That's how we are going to deal with exception. So in the same way, if you were working with a list of records and you were actually referencing a particular uh, index point in a list of records, then you should have said list exception here, because you know that if there is an error that might happen here is because of list. Or if you're not sure whether the let's say you're using a list variable also and you're using a DML statement also and you're not sure the error is because of list or DML, then as I said earlier, you can use multiple catch blocks. Yeah, you can have multiple catch blocks. Just give me one quick second. One second. Yep. Okay. So you can have, so as we discussed earlier, while we were talking about the exceptions and all, that if it finds an exception here, then this will not execute. The second catch statement will not execute because it has got the exception. So it will just straight away debug this particular line. If there is nothing found here, then this will not be, it will not debug this. If it finds error here, it will debug this. Got it? It will display the message of this particular catch statement. Fine. So for each type of exception, you can define one catch block, not more than one. So you cannot say that, okay, fine, I will create one more catch block for DML exception. That does not work. You cannot say that, okay, let me create one, because all your DML exceptions will be caught under this DML exception type only. So in this catch block only, all your DML exceptions are going to be caught. So you don't have to display, put two catch blocks for the same exception type, right? So if you are also again not sure that there can be, if you feel that there are certain variables and there can be an error because of the null pointer exception, you might want to define a null pointer exception here. So this way your debugging becomes even more simpler. It exactly catches the exception of whatever is happening in that particular stage, and it throws the error that what might have happened. Okay. So this is one way of writing it. Let's say there are three exception types that I want to catch for my code that I'm trying to execute. Then I can write it like this. Alternatively, I can also write them as just one catch statement. So this is one approach of writing it, where I am just defining the exception type. So list exception will be tracked, caught, and it will be displayed in case DML exception will be caught, it will be displayed. Null pointer exception will be caught and displayed. Sometimes we are not very sure what might be the exception, and I don't want to define different catch block for each type. Then there is another option that I have. That's basically to you can do this also. You can also define it like exception E. Okay, and system.debug e.getMessage. So if you have just used exception, we have not defined the uh, exception type, then what will happen? This exception will catch all types of exception. So even if it's a DML or a null pointer or a list exception, whatever is the exception, it will catch. Fine. So a normal exception E would catch all sort of exceptions, all type of exceptions. Fine. So that's how we deal with exceptions in our program, right? And this is something which again is very useful for debugging the code. So you are using those system.debug method. Okay. Now coming to the next concept, testing of epics. So this was all basically just debugging the code if it is not working as per your expectations, and you want to figure out what is the exception which has happened, where the exception is. You can use these methods. Now the next concept is testing of epics. Okay, whatever apex code you write, you need to test it. Obviously, whatever application we design, whatever things that we have done, everything needs to be tested, right? If you have designed a workflow rule, we test it. If we design an approval process, we test it. Testing is something which is very very important before we can actually deploy anything. Forget about apex. Even if you have uh, created a validation rule, you generally go and test it, right? You go and check it, that okay fine, if the validation rule is working properly or not, right? So same way, whatever apex code you have written, that also needs to be tested. But the concept of apex code is a little different. It's not exactly like a normal validation rule. Why? Because see, apex code can be a dynamic code. Okay, it might not be as simple as a validation rule, because validation rule is something, or a workflow rule is something which is very very straightforward thing. But my apex can have variables. It might be picking the value from a variable. It might be executing it for one record. It might be executing for bulk records. So apex code can have a lot more dynamic behavior. So when the code has a lot more dynamic behavior, its testing also needs to be done thoroughly. Not just that, okay, fine, you have written the Apex code, it runs fine for one record, you saw it is working fine, and you say that, okay, it's going to work fine. It's absolutely okay. No. The Apex code that you have written needs to be tested. Okay, and Salesforce has defined its own way of testing your Apex, just to make sure your Apex does not give too many errors when it is deployed to the customer or the end users. How does that work? So understanding testing in Apex. Testing is the key to successful long-term development. So again, we are talking about long-term development. I'm not talking about, writing Apex, testing it for one record, and then it is working fine. But if you try to use it with some other type of record, then it does not work. Or if you try to use it with a bigger set of records, it does not work. Right? That is a possibility. So testing the Apex is basically required for successful long-term development. Your Apex should run fine, errorless in the long term. That's basically the objective, and is a critical component of the development process. So testing is a critical component of the development process. Whatever you develop, that needs to be tested. Okay. Why test Apex? The reason is pretty simple. Testing is key to success of your application, particularly if your application is to be deployed to the customers. Okay, so if your application needs to be deployed to the customers, testing is very, very important. If you validate that your application works as expected, that there are no unexpected behaviors, your customers are going to trust you more, right? So it becomes very important for us to make sure that we test the Apex so that the Apex does not throw some unexpected behaviors when someone is, when my customer is trying to execute. Ways of testing an application. I'm not talking about testing Apex here. I'm just talking about testing an application. Whatever you have created, let's say whatever application. Let's just go back to the basics and try and understand ways of testing an application. There are two ways of testing an application, or instead of application, if you want, you can think about any functionality that you have developed in Apex. There are two ways of testing it. Okay, that functionality can be through a declarative, that can be through Apex code or whatever. Any functionality that you have developed, there are two ways of testing that, especially the ones that we are developing using the Apex code. One is through the Salesforce user interface. Okay, the one that you actually go to the Salesforce user interface and test it. You have written a trigger, then you write a create a record and see if the trigger is working absolutely fine or not. That's through the user interface, and that's very important. That should be done. But merely testing through the user interface will not catch all the use cases for your application. So just testing one record will not check or will not catch all the use cases of your application. Okay, so in case you have written an Apex, if it is working fine for a record, does not mean that it's going to work fine for the other record also. Got it? So that's where testing becomes important. The other way is to test for bulk functionality. Alright. So the first is to test it, to test whatever you are trying to test on the user interface. It happens for a particular record, it works okay, absolutely fine. The other way is to test for bulk functionality, and bulk records can be passed through your code. So in this particular test, what you do, you try to pass multiple records through that test, okay, and see if your Apex code is behaving properly or is it giving expected result or not. Correct. So instead of just going and testing one record on the user interface, before we can actually send the Apex code to the customers, or before we can deploy the Apex code to our customers, we should try and uh, execute the code on multiple records on a bigger chunk of data, so that to make sure that okay, is it okay with multiple records. That's how things work, right? Now, what to test in Apex? What do we need to test in Apex? What needs to be tested? I'm talking about testing Apex. What exactly I need to test? What needs to be checked? One is, the first that we need to test in Apex is a single action. Single action means if my code, the job of my code is to update a record. Is my code updating one single record or not? That's the first thing that I should be checking. True? That's the first thing that I should be testing. If I don't do that, if it does not work for single record, then there is no point actually going and checking it for multiple records. So first is check whether the single record action is happening or not happening. So that's the single action. Test to verify that a single record produces the correct expected result, which we do always. After writing a trigger or anything, we just go and check it for one single record, that okay fine, is it returning the expected result or not, right? So that's the first thing which needs to be tested. If that is fine, bulk actions need to be tested. So sometimes your code might be okay for one record, but it might not be working fine for multiple records. So you should test bulk actions. Any Apex code, whether a trigger, a class, or an extension, may be invoked for 1 to 200 records. You must test not only the single record case, but the bulk cases as well. Okay. So you should just not be happy and satisfied after testing a single record action. You should also check the bulk action using multiple records on your test. Okay, while testing Apex, you should also try to perform the operation for bulk records. Then positive behavior. Okay, what is positive behavior? Positive behavior is it doing whatever was expected? Okay, let's say I have written a trigger and I say uh, if the for example, I'm writing a trigger and I say if industry of an account, before insert, before update, go and check an account. If the industry of account is technology, description should be updated as technology account. Let's say this is my logic. Okay, so after the record is inserted, you need to check the positive behavior, which means you should go and check that if industry is technology, description actually has it become technology account or not. That's the positive behavior. Okay, what I have defined. Test to verify that the expected behavior occurs. So whatever behavior you are expecting, the positive behavior, that is working. Okay, through every expected permutation, that is that the user filled out everything correctly and did not go past the limits. Right. So if the user uh, supplies all the values and everything is supplied, then the behavior is positive. So if the industry is provided properly, it is technology, then the description is getting updated to technology account or not. So that's the positive behavior. You also need to test the negative behavior. What is negative behavior? There are likely limits to your application, such as not being able to add a future date, not being able to specify a negative amount, and so on. Right? You must test for the negative case and verify that the error messages are correctly being produced. So what is the negative behavior? Sometimes you have, you try to throw an error that if industry is this, then this error should be thrown. Correct? That's what we try to do. Those are negative behaviors. So if the value which has been supplied for the record while the update or insert or whatever is happening, is it throwing the correct exceptions or correct messages for that, or is it taking that and creating the record? That also needs to be tested, right? Positive behaviors are fine, negative behaviors also need to be tested. You must test for the negative case and verify that the error messages are correctly being produced. So if I do not supply value for a certain required field, is it giving me the correct exception or correct error message? Is it catching those? That's something again which needs to be tested. Okay. And you need to test the restricted users. Okay, so sometimes you want certain users to be restricted from performing certain operations, right? Let's say you just want to make sure, or you want to test that account being created. Like when the account is being inserted, you just want to make sure that you check who's the person who's creating the account, who's the person who initiated that code. Based on that, if there's a certain user, that user, let's say there is a user XYZ, I don't want XYZ to create accounts. Fine. So XYZ should not have the create account option available. Let's say he should not have that level of permission. Then what do? Then you need to test the restricted user also. Test whether a user with restricted access to the S object S objects used in your code sees the expected behavior. So if XYZ does not have the permission of creating accounts from his profile, let's say the permissions will be given from profile, right? So if his profile does not allow him to create accounts, you can test that when XYZ is the creator of the record, when you try to when he tries to create the record, what will be the output? Are you getting the expected behavior? Is it throwing the correct message, error message? That also needs to be tested. Test whether a user with the restricted access, the person who does not have access, and this restricted access has got nothing to do in Apex. It is basically done from the profile. So someone who does not have the access to perform a certain operation, you can test with that particular restricted user to see if the expected behavior is taking place or not. That is whether they can run the code or receive error messages, right? So whether that person can execute the code or he gets the error message, that also needs to be tested, right? So very simple. What are we testing? Single action, bulk action, positive behaviors. If everything is supplied properly, is the record being created and everything is working fine. Negative behavior, if the values are not supplied properly, are the error messages being thrown or not. Restricted user, if someone who does not have access to the S object to perform certain operations, if he tries to execute the code, does the code start working for him or not? Or my code is actually throwing error or showing proper exceptions to him. Fine. So this is what needs to be tested in Apex. Now, understanding the test data. We have talked about testing of Apex. Now, basically, what happens in testing? What we do, or while I'm talking about testing Apex, what we do, we write a little more code to. So while I'm talking about testing Apex, what exactly we do in testing? We write a bit of more Apex code with some dummy data. Fine. Now, when I say that, okay, I want to check it for bulk records, what will I do? Best is have some dummy records, let's say 200 dummy records, and test the day, code with those dummy records. That's it, nothing else. Okay. If that code executes properly, your actual code will get the code coverage. Got it? So that's how it is. So what we in testing, what we try to do, we just write the same code, which my actual code, but with most of the times with the dummy records, dummy set of records. You can do it with actual records also, or you can work with dummy set of records. Okay. So that's what we do in testing. But just think about it. If you are dealing with actual data, if you have, if you go and insert 200 accounts just for testing, is it a very good thing? Because again, unnecessary 200 records got created in your database. Now you'll have to go and clean it up. For testing, as I said that we'll test it for bulk records. So if my Apex code requires me to insert records, or if it requires me to update the records, if I go and make changes in existing 200 records, then just for testing purpose, I'm actually changing the status of 200 records, right? So let's understand how the test data works. How does the data actually behaves when you are testing Apex? Apex test data is transient and isn't committed to the database. So whatever you're doing on that, inside the test method, for testing you define test method. So when I say that you will go and test an Apex code, your Apex testing code should be written inside a test method. Okay. So whatever you do inside a test method, that actually isn't committed to the database. Any database changes are not committed to the database. Yeah, so any test method is not committed to, sorry, any DMLs and everything inside a test method are not committed to the database, which means that after a test method finishes execution, the data inserted by the test doesn't persist in the database. So if you inserted 200 records, that will not exist there in the database anymore. Okay, so you don't have to go and clean up. Or if you updated 200 records in the database, whatever changes you made will not exist. You will find after your test method execution has happened, your database comes back to the same situation where it was before the test execution, right? So that's the good part. You don't have to worry about changes happening on the database because of the test methods. As a result, there is no need to delete any test data at the conclusion of a test. So at the conclusion of the test method, after the test method execution, you do not have to go ahead and delete anything. Whatever stage it was before the test execution, after test execution also it stays in the same stage. Okay. Likewise, all the changes to existing records such as updates or deletions, so any other things, inserts, as I said, inserts will actually not happen. The same way, all your updates and deletions, in case just for testing purpose you have deleted 200 records, you don't have to worry, those 200 records will not be committed, which means they will not be permanently deleted. So all the changes to existing records such as updates or deletions also do not persist. Organization data isn't visible to test methods. Okay. By default, org data is not available in the test method. Okay. By default, the org data, like if your company has 5,000 accounts, okay, that's your data in the organization. By default, that data is not available to the test methods. So sometimes what we need to do, we need to create some dummy sample records and then update or test them. For example, let's say you have a trigger. Uh, just give me one quick second. Battery is running low on the laptop. Okay. So for an example, you have a trigger, let's say trigger T1 on some event, let's say before insert. Okay. Now what you will do, we usually test trigger with trigger.new. Sorry, we usually work with the records and context in the trigger. We use trigger.new, right? What is trigger.new? Trigger.new is basically the set of records which is in context, the list of records which is in context, right? So this is the trigger. Now you do something here, you have some code here, you have some code here. When you're trying to write a test method for this, when you're trying to test this code, okay, when you put it inside a test method, now this test method is when it is getting executed, there will not be any trigger.new to supply the value, right? Yeah. And by default, we have also understood that by default, uh, the test method does not have access to the data of my organization. So what I might need to do is I might need to create the set of records for myself. So count A equals count, okay, or count A1, whatever, then you get count. Now this is a sample record I'll have to create. Insert A1. Now I have to do the testing on this particular record. Okay. So again, as we said earlier, that if you create a certain record as a sample or a dummy record during your test method or during your testing thing, this actually will not be created or committed to the database, so you don't have to worry about this. So sometimes you might need to create some sample or dummy records just to make sure that you are able to execute your testing on those dummy records. You got it? So that's the concept here. So that's what we are talking here. By default, data isn't visible to test method. Your data is not visible to the test method, and you should create test data for your test method. To execute the test method, you should create test data also, dummy data. Okay. Now, okay. So let's see how we can actually write a test for a small trigger. Okay, so let's have a trigger, and then we'll write a test method for that. Okay, and we will create some sample data for that. All right, just give me one quick moment. Okay, so let's write a trigger, and let's write a test for that trigger. Okay, and we will use sample data, all right, for our testing. So the accounts, triggers. Okay, that's a trigger. Description is a before insert event. In this trigger I am writing for account A in figure dot new. I just want to go and check the industry of the account. Let's say if A dot industry equals technology, I want to assign A dot description equals is an technology account. Okay, so this is my trigger, right? Now, what do I need to test in this trigger? We talked about it. Single action. Single action is something which we can do from the. Let me take you back to that slide. So, in your code, what needs to be tested? Going back to. Does anyone remember what needs to be tested? Okay, coming back to the same slide. Single action. Single action is something which can be tested from the UI. So, no problem with that. Bulk action needs to be tested. Multiple records. Positive behavior needs to be tested. Negative behavior needs to be tested. Restricted user needs to be tested. Right? So now it does not mean that every time you'll have to test everything. Whatever is applicable. In this particular case, the positive behavior is applicable. Single action and bulk action definitely we'll have to test. Single action I can test it from user interface also, or even if I am testing a bulk action, that will take care of single action also. So basically I should test this code for multiple records, and I should test the positive behavior, because in this code I have a positive behavior. If the value is something, if industry is something, description should be made something. This is a positive behavior. I'm not talking about any exceptions, errors and all that stuff. If that was the case, then that would have been the negative behavior. I would needed to test near negative behavior. In this case, I have a positive behavior which needs to be tested. Needs to be tested for bulk records. Currently, I do not have any other user who is restricted from accessing or creating account in my system, right? So I don't need the restricted user test. So what I need bulk action test, and I need to test it for positive behavior, whether it is behaving the same way or not, right? To write this or to test this, what I have to do? I have to create multiple account records. So basically, to just to make sure that this is working fine for multiple records, what will I have to do? All that I have to do is I have to create multiple records with industry equals technology, and I have to go and see if once I insert those records, after the insert, if the description of all those records have got updated to technology account or not, whatever I have given. That's it. Correct. That's what I need to test. So now, where will you write the test uh, method? You will write the test method in a separate class, and that class has to start with at is test annotation. click on new. Okay, and what you have to do is, because this is a class which you are creating for testing, you should start the code here with @is test annotation. Okay, this should be the first annotation of this class because you're writing it for testing, so that Salesforce understands that the code in this particular class is all meant for testing. Another advantage of using @is test annotation is that whatever apex you write inside this will not be counted against your limit. So there is a limit of number of characters that you can write in apex. Okay, you get 3 million characters to write, but whatever you write inside this class @is test annotation, because @is test is just for testing purpose, right? So this is not counted against the limit. Okay, now you just define the class as we were doing earlier, public class c1 c2 or whatever t1. In this class you have to define a test method, and in that test method what I will do, I will create some sample account records, insert them and check the behavior of the uh, positive behavior, based on the trigger that we have defined. So what all that I have to do is I just have to go and define test method. A test method should always be defined as a test method. It is a void method, which means it does not return anything, and name of the test method m1, that's it. And inside this what I have to do, I have to create multiple sample accounts with the industry technology, and I'll have to insert them and check the behavior, so it's working absolutely okay or not. So because I have to deal with bulk records, so this time I will define list of accounts. List of account. Okay, now this list of account I'm not fetching from any query or anything, so I'm gonna create the dummy records. For creating dummy records, let me just put a loop I equals 0, less than 200, I plus plus. Okay, equals new account name equals text account plus I. Okay, so what will this do? It will create 200 dummy accounts. Okay, and we also need to supply the industry equals technology. Okay, 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 so this for loop is gonna add 200 records to my list ACTS, list of accounts ACTS. It will have 200 records by the end of this for loop. I've not yet performed the DML operation. Right? DML needs to be performed here. So I'll perform it outside the loop. So now what I can do is I can write test dot start test test dot stop test. Okay, test dot start test, test dot stop test is optional. You might or might not put it. Why do we need test dot start test? Because I've already mentioned this method as a test method, which means it's a test method. Then why are we again doing the test dot start test and test dot stop test? The only reason is that the governor limit is refreshed inside this. Okay, you get a fresh set of governor limits inside the test dot start test. Okay, so if you see, if you feel that you have exhausted some governor limit while defining the variables and all that stuff, or certain queries you have already written here, then your test dot start test will give you a fresh set of governor limits for the test dot start test again. Okay, otherwise if you don't write this, all the governor limits, the limit will completely be applicable on all the lines of code in this method. Got it? So that's the only advantage. Apart from that, there's no other advantage of test dot start test. So especially in this case, if we see, we have actually not exhausted any of the governor limits. We have not done queries, we have not done DML statement. So we ideally don't need it, but just for your understanding, we are doing it here in this case. Now you try and insert the accounts. So this accounts is basically the list of 200 account records which were created or which were added into my for loop. I'm inserting all those accounts, test dot stop test. So come out of it. Okay. Now I have to check the positive behavior. Correct. Now the records have got inserted. What do I need to do? I have to check the positive behavior whether the description has got updated properly or not. Right, for all these records. So I will just define one more list of account. Give it some other name, inserted accounts. Data has been inserted into the database, so I can run an SQL query to fetch that data, right? So you can say select name description from account where ID in right. So I have run a query to fetch all the records which we just inserted, and name of the variable is inserted accounts. Now for these records which are retrieved from this query, I just have to go and check whether the description has been updated correctly or not. So because it's multiple records, again I have to put a for loop here. For account A in inserted accounts, I will just go and check whether description's value is that or not. What was the exact thing that we gave for it? whether the description is equals to this or not. This is what I have to check. This is a positive behavior which I'm going to. So to check this, all that you have to do is you just have to use a method, a predefined method, which is called system.assert equals. System.assert equals. This value I want to check against description. Header description. So the system dot assert equals will check if a dot description is equals to this particular value or not. Got it? So it is going to check it one by one for all the records. That's it. So my positive behavior will be tested here. Expected to line 6. Line number 18. Yeah, it's fine. So I've written a test class and that test method, and the test method is going to check the behavior, positive behavior for the account insert is happening properly or not. Right? Now, the concept is when you write a test method for testing some Apex code, and when you execute that method, so when I execute this method which I have defined now, it will provide code coverage to the actual uh, code, to the trigger. It will provide code coverage, right? The moment this behavior gets tested, your actual code will receive a code coverage. Now see, Salesforce has a concept that before you can deploy any code, understand this, before you can deploy any code, either from sandbox to production, or if you want to create a package, and in that package if you have an Apex code, that Apex code needs to have 75% of code coverage. So 75% means if there are 20 lines of code, 15 lines of code should be covered with your test methods. Okay, now how will you cover? You'll have to write test method for the code, and the test method, once you execute the test method, it executes successfully if it finds the results, uh, and if it does not find any problem in the behaviors and all, then it's gonna automatically supply the code coverage to the actual code. Like now when I execute this will give code coverage to my trigger. Got it? So that's the concept. Minimum 75% of code coverage is required for the Apex before it can be deployed either to a package or to production. Okay. If you go back to the trigger right now, the one that we just created, this is the one that we created. If you go back to this, 0% code coverage right now, right? Because there has not been any test method to test the code which has been written inside it. For that reason, at this point of time, the code coverage is 0%, right? But if you want to get code coverage for it, all that you have to do is you just have to go and run that test. Running test is pretty simple. You can just go to Apex classes, and from here you can say run all test. It will run all the tests, all the test methods and everything. Okay. Now once this has been executed, now let me go to the same trigger and see if it has got the code coverage. See, now it's 100% code coverage. The behavior and everything is absolutely working fine. I have done that through system.debug. That test method finds that this code is absolutely okay. It's working good for one record, it's working good for 200 records, and the positive behavior is also working fine. So I've received the code coverage for it. So the same way, whatever code you are writing, you will have to write test for that, and you know usually even if you are not able to achieve 100% code coverage, you should at least be able to achieve 75% of code coverage before you can deploy the Apex to the production or sandbox. 75% code coverage means, again, as I said, it depends on number of lines. Okay. So number of lines means if there are 20 lines of code, okay, if there are 20 lines of code, 15 lines should be covered. So you should have written test methods to test at least 15 lines of it. Okay, so once that part is tested, it will automatically give code coverage to that particular thing. Got it? So if there was a negative behavior, then you needed to check the negative behavior, whether the error message is being thrown is correct or not. Let's say there was, instead of this trigger, you had a trigger where you said in the industry's technology, uh, trigger dot add error or a dot add error, and there is an error message. Then you, instead of this positive behavior, you needed to test the negative behavior, right? So system.set equals should have worked with the error message, right? So that's how the negative behavior will be tested. In case I have any negative behavior set up. Got it? Now let me know if there is any question or doubt with the testing part, or with exceptions handling, or with debugging.